meet you.
You can touch me. Yeah, so.
Dogs have owners and cats have staff.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that's really lovely place. Wow.
I have this pomegranate tree.
Yeah, wow.
And my wife has been very busy designing the garden.
Did you plant this tree?
Yeah.
So it was really small.
35 years ago.
35 years ago.
We moved here, in a minute, we moved here in 1984, 37 years. I said, look, if little Johnny is supposed to be with Daddy on Saturday, and if he isn't with Daddy on Saturday, then on Sunday you show up at 8:30 with your toothbrush, because I'm going to send you to prison for 3 days.
Wow. So judge can have a better sense than a psychiatrist. That's what you just said.
I'm sure there are people who think a borderline personality disorder is somebody who lives near the Lebanon border and is upset because the Hezbollah are throwing bombs. And unfortunately, parental alienation has become an industry in the same way that family law has become an industry. And part of their identity stolen.
Thank you for your dedication for this very important and serious, for somebody, life cost issue.
Yeah. Thank God in my family no one has experienced this.
Yeah.
But that may be, in fact, that may help, because I'll be able to look at it, from a disinterested point of view.
Right.
That I have no personal interest in this. We have people in the family who didn't speak to their brothers and sisters for decades.
Right.
Okay? But that usually happened in young adulthood rather than in childhood.
Yeah. It happened by their choice.
Yeah, or it may be for good reasons, maybe for wrong reasons, maybe for reasons that have been forgotten.
Right.
But that happens. And in our history, we know that Joseph wasn't in contact with Jacob for 22 years for all kinds of reasons, but he was in Egypt. So that was that parental alienation. His brothers caused him to be sold into slavery. But then they asked, so why didn't he write a letter? Even in those days, there were camels going up and down between Egypt.
Okay, Philip, it's nice to meet you again, and it's such an honor to be able to talk in a person, right? Not that Zoom anymore.
It's great.
It's so great that we both in Jerusalem, and now we're in a nice garden. I really enjoy this place. So I have so many questions for you, but first I think I should introduce myself, because we both are sharing a very same views, like a systemic approach on the child, on the family, and on the law. But I myself have experience as an alienated mother. It happened in 2010 when my ex-husband and his family decided that they don't want me anymore in my and our baby's life. And she was only 2.5 at that time. And they moved from the St. Petersburg, the city where we lived, to another region, to Black Sea region, south of Russia. And since then, I've been there many, many times. And the courts, of course, like chopping jurisdiction happened, because even though we lived in St. Petersburg and she was born, my daughter was born there, but because they moved there, all the court processes has to be moved where they live now. And the place where they live is famous for corruption. And I had no chance, and all court decision that I've been through, even I was fighting, and I changed probably 15 lawyers through my journey, and I could not succeed anything. And I could not see my daughter since they decided that I wouldn't see her. And my journey took me like 4 years. It's all being documented, and it's actually been published as a book which called Louder Than Silence. And it's my journey fighting for my mother's right, for my daughter's right to have her parents. And the funny thing about that, when my book was published, I haven't heard the term parental alienation. I never heard that. So I use the term a family kidnapping. And when I was applying for the different institutions in Russia, asking them to pay any attention for that kind of scenarios, because I start meeting other parents in the same situation. So we use that term of family kidnapping. And only after the book was published, I actually have to learn, and I find that parental alienation term, and I start, of course, learning more and studying more, and I became a first member from Russia in PSG group, Parental Alienation Study Group. And by then I'm already moved to Israel, where we are now. And you are the very famous expert of this topic, and you definitely have a different way you came to this point. Yes. And I would like to know your story. I know that you was born in Birmingham. I was there. I was in libraries there. It's a very nice place, even the weather was very bad and horrible at the time. But I just wonder if it's any interesting story behind your how you arrived to the point of being an expert of parental alienation.
Okay. So, as you said, I was born in Birmingham in England. I did my law studies at University College London. I became a lawyer in London, and I got married there in 1974. And in 1978, we moved to Israel with 3 little children. I requalified as a lawyer. I had my own office for 15 years. And in 1995, they passed the Family Court Law, which unifies all the jurisdictions to deal with family cases in one specialist court. And they were looking for lawyers who specialized in family law in order to become judges. I had already made my application to become a judge before that. So that in 1995 I was appointed as a judge. In the meantime, we had 4 more children. So I started in the family court in February 1995, and I dealt with family cases until 2012. In the course of that, I got more and more interested in family law. I got more and more interested in what goes on in other parts of the world. I attended international conferences, and I also did a master's degree at Haifa University, a special program for serving judges. And I realized that I enjoy academic research and I enjoy writing. As a judge, of course, you're researching and writing the whole time, but it's specifically for the case that you're dealing with. Right. And I wanted to spread out and deal with the things what interested me. So I was able to take early retirement 9 years ago now. And since then I've been reading, researching, writing, lecturing here and in many countries abroad about various aspects of family law. While I was a judge, even when I was a lawyer, I handled cases where there was no contact between a child and a parent. And in the course of my activities as a judge, I became more and more interested in what happens to children when the parents are fighting, because the children are not usually a party to the case. It's the parents who are the parties. And the child is not really involved, or not enough involved.
They are bullets, they are not the party.
They're either bullets or they're a package that needs to be moved from one place to another.
Right.
So I got more interested in the voice of the child, how the child expresses himself, how the voice of the child comes before the court. And the court system, the family court system here, is more therapeutically oriented than it is in many other countries, and in family law particularly. So, for example, there is a social work unit which is attached to the court here with very well qualified social workers who are available for the parties and for the judge for consultations. So I combined all that together and came to the conclusion that I wanted to start researching properly and writing about family law generally and family courts, how to make family courts function better, particularly where there are children or adults with special needs involved. As far as alienation is concerned, as I say, I handled cases like this when I was a lawyer. I also handled them as a judge. But the term parental alienation, it wasn't really part of the dialogue in those days. And in fact, even now, the terminology of parental alienation is, in my view, inadequate. It's misleading, it's ambiguous. It's not clear who is alienating whom. Maybe it's the child alienating the parent, maybe the child's at fault. Maybe the parent who is alienated causes it because that parent is violent, obnoxious beast. So I started to talk and write about contact failure, which doesn't blame the child or the parent, but it describes a situation when contact has failed. It's stopped happening. Now we're talking about other terms as well. We're talking about child-parent contact problems. That's a phrase that was used in the Family Court Review in the special edition that came out a few months ago, which I have an article in. Now they're also talking about contact interference. That's a phrase which is used now in Israel to describe a situation when one parent interferes with contact between the child and the parent. So parental alienation, as well as being ambiguous, it also invites a great deal of opposition, particularly from feminist groups and others,
yes,
who either say it doesn't exist or they say it's manufactured.
Right.
And I can speak about that as well because I've written on that topic.
Absolutely. I just want to stop you here because you already mentioned so many things, and I cannot miss a thing and not asking you, because we're in Israel and you was a judge for almost 20 years here in Israel, and I haven't found it in any of your interviews before, and I want to ask you, as I know, I never been in a court here, thanks God. I've been a lot in Russia enough, and I've been in the US, but just as a visitor in Federal Court of Cleveland. It's another story. As I know, there are a secular court system and as a religious court system. Of course, you've been a part of a secular court system, and you saying that it's a pretty progressive system compared to other countries' systems. But what about the religious court system, where I believe a lot of parental alienation take place because of that court system decide that if one of the parents is not religious enough, I mean, I say it very simple way, but then the kids stand with another more religious parent.
That's simply not correct.
Okay.
What you've heard
Yeah.
is obviously what you've read in newspapers, but The fact is that the judges in the religious courts, both the rabbinical courts that deal with Jews and the Sharia courts who deal with Muslims, they also have social services units. Most of the judges there now have a legal education, as well as their education in the issues of the religious law that they're dealing with. And the law is the same law in the sense that it regards the best interests of the child as being the paramount interest. When there's a dispute about religious matters, so the religious courts will look at the needs of the specific child and the ability of each parent to supply those needs. Obviously, there is a case that one of the parents rejects the lifestyle of the other parent, then there'll be a tendency to give the child to the parent who does not reject the lifestyle of the other. So the child will be able to benefit from both families.
Right.
But I know I also dealt with cases where one parent was religious or became religious and the other was not religious.
Right. Or became not religious.
Or became not religious, exactly.
Yeah.
And the criteria are the same. This particular child in this particular family, and the abilities and the availability of the parents to look after the child. So and one of the main interests which is looked after in the courts and in the religious courts is to try and find a solution without having to make a decision, a judicial decision. It's trying to help the parties, the parents, and encourage them to find a solution by agreement.
Right.
And that's very much the role of the court social services unit, but also the judge, him or herself.
Right.
In this area, I have lectured to the judges in the rabbinical courts about parental alienation and found them to be accepting that this does exist and adopting some of the methods that I suggest to handle the cases more efficiently.
Right.
And more effectively, and I'm sure we'll come on to deal with that part of it.
So when you mentioned that court should encourage parents, and one of your interview you also was talking of the case when you basically enforced a parent to either provide the time of other parents spend with the child, or bring a toothbrush next time.
Yes.
Because the parents could go to jail for 3 days. What do you think? Why not every judge can make such an enforcement like you did?
This is an issue that I've come across in many, many different countries, and there are probably many reasons why judges do not take a very strong enforcement approach. One of the reasons may be that, unlike in Israel, where in order to be appointed a judge in the family court, you have to have experience and knowledge in the field. And there is in-service training for family court judges. So there's a compulsory seminar every year for 3 or 4 days. So once every 2 or 3 years, they will have psychologists and social workers and other experts in child development lecturing to the judges, so they have knowledge in the field. In many countries, maybe in most countries, judges who deal with family cases do not know enough about what goes on in families in order to be able to understand the sensitivity and to adjudicate. They don't understand what happens to parents, and they don't understand what happens to children enough to enable them to give the cases the priority they need, and also enable to understand the seriousness of what's really going on. So that's maybe one reason. There is another reason, that is that not all countries give the power to the judge who tries the case to do the enforcement. It's handed over to a different authority, to the execution office, the bailiffs, sheriffs. They're given all kinds of different names. And that leads to a cutout between the reasoning why the court ordered what it ordered and what the sheriffs or bailiffs think they ought to be doing. There was a case before the European Court of Human Rights involving Moldova, where the judge made a decision that the child should be transferred from one parent to the other. But the bailiff's office had a different idea. They apparently, the other parent had spoken to them and persuaded them. The bailiff's office called the police, and the police called the mayor. So when the parent came to collect the child, the bailiff's office said, no, this isn't the interest of the child. So the thing was not enforced. Here specifically, the judge who tries the case has the authority to deal with all the enforcement of the judgment, or the execution of the judgment. There may be another reason, and that is that there may not be appropriate legislation which allows the court to impose a sanction for non-compliance. That may be the law simply doesn't provide for that. In Israel, the law relating to children gives the court the power to make any decision necessary in the interest of the child. That's embodied in a law of 1962, which is still in force. And that means that the judge can be very inventive in providing sanctions for somebody who doesn't comply and providing encouragement for somebody who does comply. So, for example, one of my colleagues, he said, why don't we use the sanctions that we use against debtors who don't pay? Stop them leaving the country, saying they can't have a credit card and so on. And they've used these sanctions against parents who do not comply with orders.
Right.
In Israel, we inherited from the British the contempt of court ordinance,
Right.
which enables the court to impose a fine or imprisonment for non-compliance. The idea here is not to punish. The idea is to ensure compliance. And that means that while there is a law in Israel that if you fail to comply with an order of the court, you can be charged by the police and tried and go to prison. That takes months or years. There are other countries in which failure to hand over a child is a criminal offence, but it takes a terribly long time. Where a party sees that there's been a contempt of court, he can go immediately to the court which made the judgment and say, look, I want this enforced. So in a matter of days, the judge will call in the party who's not complying and say, look, you comply, or there'll be a fine. There'll be a fine every time. It's 300 shekels in the first case, 600 shekels in the second case, 1,200 shekels in the third case. Or, as the case that I quote, there was a mother who was not compliant, and it was only because this was 12 years ago, I didn't know enough about contact interference until I realized how serious this was. But eventually I said, look, if little Johnny is supposed to be with Daddy on Saturday, and if he isn't with Daddy on Saturday, then on Sunday you show up at 8:30 with your toothbrush, because I'm going to send you to prison for 3 days.
Right.
And the kid's going to be with Daddy anyway. Right. So what would you prefer?
It's so effective.
And years later, I met the father,
Right.
who said that he's still seeing the kid. But that requires a constellation
Right.
of a judge who is sufficiently educated and sensitive to what's going on.
Right.
We also have here what is, I understand, to be quite rare, and that is one family, one judge.
Right.
This particular case, I dealt with the mother's previous custody issues. She'd been married to somebody else.
Okay.
So I knew her, I knew about her.
Right.
And from the initial
Like a family
stage,
doctor.
Exactly. From the initial stage when this case came before me, I dealt with every stage of the case. so that I was able to understand the dynamics.
Right.
I was able to understand where the lawyers were coming from. I was able to look at all the documents, and it saves a tremendous amount of time.
I just want to ask you, if she officially had a diagnosed as a borderline disorder at that time, or it was your perception of her behavior?
It's my perception only.
Okay. It's very important. I can understand.
Yes.
I can explain why, because you and me, we've been in research in parental alienation long enough to understand that it's a very complicated, multidisciplinary issue between psychology, sometimes psychiatry, and the law, and the family dynamics. Sometimes goes through the generation, like transgenerational thing, and. For that, of course, not every judge, because, normal human, we who applying to court, we think sometimes of judges as special super people, superhumans, but they are not. They are just irregular people. Some of them are extraordinary people, like you, for example.
If you say so.
Because you had a certain condition here where you can put your power, but you had also your curiosity to research a lot, to be able to make the best and provide the best decision you could. And that takes like all that puzzle to be complete. And not every judge has it. And not every judge understands that dynamics and has any psychological experience of different parents. And many judges are easy to trick by a parent who is basically the severe alienator, but pretending to be a victim of the divorce and to be a victim of other parent. And I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. I've been in a many situation where a judge was sympathizing to my ex-husband and thinking that every bullshit he was talking about me must be true, because otherwise what the reason he should have to taking a child away from the mother. And I know many situations like that. So my question to you is, should a judge to have some kind of psychological training as well, where they can learn about the dynamics, especially about parental alienation dynamics?
This is a huge question, which doesn't only apply in family law, it applies in every area. Judges are appointed because they have legal experience. They're appointed because they have experience in taking on large quantities of information from different sources and try and sort out what actually happened, or what the legal rule is that applies to these cases. That's not always the case. In England, for example, they have lay magistrates, people who have no legal training, but they're known to be people of good character, and they have a legal advisor sitting with them. The idea there is that they are of the people, and they know what goes on in real life. But in most countries, judges are, of course in America, judges are elected on the basis of their party affiliation in many states,
Right.
which is something that I've never understood. I don't think that political affiliation should have anything to do with judging ability.
Okay.
There is also a matter of career structure. In Israel, you only get appointed to the family court if you want to. If you don't want to deal with family cases, they'll put you somewhere else. Whereas in many countries, in order to advance, a judge will be appointed. You may have, I sat with a judge in a particular court in the United States. He was an expert in building defects. But in order to progress in the system, to climb up the ladder, he had to do 2 years dealing with traffic accidents, and 2 years dealing with bankruptcy, and 2 years dealing with family law, and 2 years dealing with medical negligence. He had no interest in family law. He didn't want to be doing family law, but he was doing family law because that's what you have to do. Now, to try and expect that somebody, even after 2 years, knows enough about families and family law to be able to deal with the exceptional complexity of family cases. That's a pipe dream. It won't happen. Here, a judge is appointed to the family court because he has experience in the field and can expect to be in the family court for 10 years or more until he gets promoted or until he says he's had enough. So there's a matter of the career structure. Alongside that, there's a matter of training. I mentioned that here we have in-service training for family judges, but there are many jurisdictions where there is no provision or no requirement that a judge should have training in any particular field. It also, many judges, many jurisdictions, there is a feeling that anyone who tells a judge about a new discipline, that in some way damages his judicial independence, which of course is highly important to avoid pressure from the regime. And I understand enough about what was going on in the Soviet Union, and I understand it still goes on in some of the former Soviet Union states, that the state itself appoints the judges and tells them what to do.
Their power pretty limited, if you want,
Right.
asking me about that. As I learned that system a little bit as a journalist, and even find out the price which someone should pay for this decision or another one.
Yeah, that is, in some places, that's part of the system.
Yeah.
And therefore the judge is not being paid to use his intellect to decide what's right or wrong or how to determine the case.
They should be flexible.
He's basically a creature of the state which appointed him. Mm-hmm. There are other issues as well. As you say, it's complex. I don't think I'm alone. I know plenty of other judges in Israel who've taken it on themselves to study and learn and understand what's going on. Some of them do not, some of them have not. But at the very least, they have these in-service training sessions. They're exposed to the issue. And they have a social work unit which is there, among other things, to help them and advise them. Also, it depends a great deal on the lawyers who are appearing in the case. Mm-hmm. Because if the lawyer is educated and understands, then the lawyer can educate the judge. You don't say that, right? Yeah. You suggest that the judge might be interested in reading this article.
Providing certain information.
Right. Or may be interested in referring to a case that's been decided previously with similar facts.
Right.
That depends on the lawyer having the special knowledge and the experience to enable him or her to present the thing to the judge. Now, in some countries, lawyers do not regard that as being their job. Yeah. They and there are many lawyers here as well, who winning the case is the highest thing they can do. And of course, the child who is at the center of it always loses, where one side thinks they ought to win.
Right.
Just want to add one other thing, which is to do with the philosophy of law.
Right.
Certainly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, where there's a common law system, it's binary: win, lose, guilty, not guilty.
Yeah.
Did the offence or didn't do the offence which caused damage.
Right.
Where family cases are really not appropriate for that binary approach.
Absolutely.
It's a spectrum, and you need to be able to think of all the possible resolutions that can happen.
Can benefit all the sides of it.
You have to understand also that mediation as a dispute resolution technique, it only started in Israel maybe 20 years ago. The judges actually had training seminars in mediation, so they would know what a mediator does, and they'd be able to use mediation skills when they're talking to litigants. So some of them accepted it more, some less. We have that, built into the system, but not all judges are up for that. So there are a number of different issues. I don't think I'm unique. I know plenty of judges from around the world who have made it their business to get a deeper understanding of what happens in families. And certainly the dream is that it's going to take a generation, that any judge who is appointed to deal with family cases will have to have the training and the orientation that we're trying to instill in Israel. Okay, so that's a long question. I can remember a case where I was representing a father in the district court. In those days, before they founded the family court in 1995, these cases were dealt with in the district court. And I remember dealing with a case where the mother was making trouble about contacts, and I was representing the father. The judge, I remember the judge, it was Judge Shalom Brenner, who was a very experienced, a very wise judge. And I think together we came to the conclusion there's something funny going on here, something which is not normal in the way the mother was behaving and why she was making difficulties for the father. That's probably the first case where I consciously became aware there was something abnormal going on. Those who lecture and write about parental alienation say it's counterintuitive. Our intuition is, and our experience usually is, that parents love their children, that parents respect the other parent, and they wouldn't do anything to interfere unless there was a very, very good reason. As you said, you experienced that. The judge couldn't understand why the father would take the child away unless there was some very, very good reason for that. It goes back to a previous question which I didn't answer about personality disorders, so perhaps I could talk about that now. Most people don't know what personality disorders are. Most people, probably most judges, have a sketchy knowledge of psychology and psychiatry, which they get from reading books and reading newspaper articles and seeing films and programs on the television. And they have a very sketchy understanding of what the different what the different psychiatric problems are, and even if they understand basically what schizophrenia is, what paranoia is, because these are things which are spoken about, they may have a very, very wrong idea of what it actually is. Personality disorders are very low down in the list of things that people actually get to be exposed to and understand. They may say, this is a horrible person, or this is a nasty person, or this is a person who's very selfish. And all of us have those traits within us. When it starts to affect the functioning of that person or functioning with other people in society, at that point, it can be defined as a personality disorder. Now, the terminology is also very peculiar. We talk about antisocial personality disorder. Now, okay, we all know there are horrible people who commit crimes and so on. They may be antisocial, but it may not be a personality disorder. We know a narcissist is somebody who loves himself. Okay, we all love ourselves, otherwise we wouldn't be able to function. A person with a narcissistic personality disorder is doing other things. And the term borderline, I'm sure there are people who think a borderline personality disorder is somebody who lives near the Lebanon border and is upset because the Hezbollah are throwing bombs, right?
That's very funny.
Borderline is a very specific type of personality. It has its history in the childhood or adolescence of the person who's involved. I actually came across one of these when I was a lawyer. A lady I was representing in a criminal case, because I'm an inquisitive person, as you have mentioned. I wanted to find out what was going on there. So I discovered about borderline personality disorder. I started learning about personality disorders. As regards the specific lady you were talking about, where I had threatened her with prison, there was no diagnosis of a personality disorder because no one had raised the issue that there was anything actually wrong with her. She was a very charming lady, a very good-looking lady, spoke beautifully. She changed her lawyers 3 or 4 times for no reason that I could see. And when she was not represented, she would write her own story, but in every document she'd write her entire life story from start to finish. And I started thinking there's something strange here, and I looked up, and I came to the conclusion that this is probably a borderline personality. Also, the relationship with her ex-husband. These are all pointers.
Yeah.
Now, I lectured to psychologists and psychiatrists, and I told them that a psychiatrist who sees a borderline for the first time will not notice anything wrong. A psychologist will administer tests, but the tests are not sensitive to many personality disorders. A judge with one family, one judge, who's seeing this person over a period of months, several times in the courtroom, may be better able to pick up the signs of a personality disorder than a psychologist or a psychiatrist who is asked to advise on a case and maybe interviews the person twice and does testing and so on. So I realize my view is unorthodox, if you can use that word, as to how you deal or how you identify people with personality disorders. I would never write in a judgment that this person has a personality disorder, but certainly my awareness that this is possibly what's going on helped me to manage the case. In that particular case, mediation didn't work. In that particular case, talking with social workers didn't help because of this lady's personality. She was able to manipulate the system, spin out the mediation over a long period of months with no result. And that's why at the end, I came to the conclusion we have to stop this. And that was the conclusion I came to. And in this particular case, it worked.
Wow. So judge can have a better sense than a psychiatrist, that's what you just said.
If we're talking about, because the judge, again, it's one of the advantages of having the family attached to a judge. It has disadvantages, and that is that they tend to see the judge as being the daddy of the whole system. So every time somebody sneezes, they want to come to the judge to sort things out. You become the sort of super uncle.
Right.
So that can happen. But the advantages outweigh the disadvantages of that. So I've told you about personality disorders.
And Louder Than Silence is the book that also translated into English, and it's going to be published soon in US.
Okay, very good.
I would love to ship it to you too. It's a long story though.
Okay, I might get to it.
Yeah.
Can't promise.
Yeah. It's a very long story. But this story opened the public discussion in Russia.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Something has to kickstart.
It says first in Russia book about family kidnapping.
Kidnapping itself is a very interesting phenomenon because it fits in perfectly with parental alienation.
Yeah.
I have a lecture saying that inter-country kidnapping is dealt with by the Hague Convention. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's called abduction.
Yeah.
But even when a parent relocates the child to a place which is distant from the other parent, or even when the parent with whom the child doesn't live moves, that reduces the amount of contact between the parent and the child. And that should only be done by agreement or with the permission of the court. I saw a judgment yesterday of one of the judges in Israel the mother wanted to move 30 or 40 kilometers away. And the judge said, no, if you don't get agreement, you don't move.
Agreement with the father. Yeah.
Exactly. Unless you can convince the court. What that means is that there is an increasing understanding that interference with the level of contact can affect the child. And it doesn't have to be alienation.
Yeah.
They may still, if your ex-husband had moved from St. Petersburg to Odessa, right? But there was still contact and visits and Skype or Zoom or phone calls or something like that. Then at least there's some contact involved. Yeah. But the Hague Convention says that in cases of abduction, courts must deal with these matters very quickly.
Yeah.
And there are regulations in every country as to how quickly these cases have to be dealt with. But with alienation, there are no such rules.
Exactly. And even Russia, which signed Hague Convention, as you said, I think it was 2011 or 12, and it's only between another country and Russian Federation.
Right.
But within the country, they still don't recognize it as any crime.
But even in a territory like Russia,
exactly,
you've got 4 time zones and thousands of miles. There are those in some countries who are, I've seen case law where they are invoking the ideas of the Hague Convention, even for relocation within the country. There are some countries where they're doing that because they understand that the basic premise is...
Maybe Brazil?
Don't know about Brazil, but I can't remember where I saw this from.
I was in Mexico with my book as well, and it started a big reformation after.
Yeah.
And it's great to see how the law of certain states actually taking that seriously.
Yeah. I've looked at the Brazilian law, and Romania also has made alienation a criminal offence. And I've written an article about that as well, where I've said that criminal offence is really not the answer. Making it a criminal offence expresses the fact that we don't like it and we think it's a bad thing.
And implement a punishment. Yeah.
But until you get there, until the police start investigating, they don't understand what it is. And then the procurator starts investigating. Right. He doesn't know what it is. And until they decide to file a charge sheet, and then it goes to the criminal court. And the criminal court is dealing with very serious crimes, and they don't regard alienation as being a very serious crime. So it goes to the end of the list. So in 3 years' time, and then, of course, the child has moved on, the parents have moved on. What are you going to do? A fine, a few thousand euros. You're going to put someone in prison for something that happened 3 years ago, and there's no blood in the streets.
No.
So making it a criminal offence, it's a nice idea, but the practicalities. Also, it has another effect. Supposing that a properly constituted family court is trying to persuade the alienating parent to see what he or she has done and to put things right.
Yeah.
But if that person is facing criminal charges, they will never admit that they did anything wrong.
Yeah.
So the criminal process can in fact interfere with the reconciliation. And again, we're seeing the alienated parent being very angry and the criminal case is going on. It doesn't help the child.
No. Yeah.
Because every day that the child isn't seeing the parent, it sinks deeper and deeper into the pit, and it's more difficult to hoik them out. So I have doubts as to whether prosecuting as a criminal offence is going to actually have any positive effect. It may in fact have the opposite effect.
Interesting idea. So you believe in prevention?
I believe in prevention. There are really two areas that I'm talking about. One is prevention, primary prevention, establishing that people should know what it is, that professionals who deal with children and their parents should know what it is, and get the parents and the child into some kind of treatment or some kind of re-education as early as possible. But if it does get to court, then it has to be dealt with quickly, it has to be dealt with efficiently, there have to be clear orders made as to what the parents are supposed to do, and sanctions, if immediate sanctions, if they don't do it. Because it's all very well if a case goes on in the family court for a year or 2 years, and then the judge writes a judgment, and nothing happens, then there's a tremendous waste of time and resources for the parents and for the state, and nothing's happened. But if you can get these cases to the stage of an enforceable order within 2, 3, 4 months of starting the case, and then you enforce the orders, then you've got a chance of lifting the child out of this situation. So that requires, of course, specialist family courts, specialist family judges. It requires having the social services available around the psychologist, so you can, in fact, get the professional help that the court needs. And these are all programs that need to be worked on, and a lot of it's to do with professional training.
And that's what your next manual book is about.
Yeah.
And it's addressed to all professionals, including judges, family judges.
So there are two issues here, right? I'm a judge, right? I'm going to need help from the other professionals in drawing up these handbooks. Also, I do not think at the moment it's possible to draw up a handbook based on one country's system, which is going to be useful in all other countries' systems. I'm not sure if even in the United States, where you have Texas, which has one kind of system, and Massachusetts has a different kind of system, a different orientation. I'm not sure that the handbook in one place is going to be useful for another. So there's a challenge in writing it in such a way that is going to be useful
in universal
in a universal way. One of the things I've been thinking about is to develop a kind of smorgasbord, right? A sort of buffet, right? So which has recommendations, some of which may be applicable in some countries and some in other countries.
Right.
That's after establishing the general principles that we want to work with.
Right.
But we're not at that stage yet.
What is your personal and professional opinion about Richard Gardner, who first invented this term?
You asked me about the first time I came across this. What do I think about Gardner?
Yeah.
Now, there's been a lot of criticism of Gardner.
Right.
Most of it is ill-educated and propagandist. He identified a particular situation. He said it was only women who do it. That was maybe appropriate in the 1960s when he was writing, that people thought that way.
That almost the most of the cases, he said in his Vancouver lecture, I remember.
Yeah.
He said fathers did it as well, but the percentage is much less.
In my understanding, that's simply not right. The reason why it may appear that women do it more is that usually women have custody of the child. And therefore they are more likely in that context to be blamed for the lack of contact with the child by the father. But that is an artifact from the numbers that I know. Men and women are just as likely, within the range of 47-53, a not significant statistical change, to alienate their children. Gardner also, he's called it a syndrome. There's a lot of criticism of what is it, a syndrome. A syndrome is a specific word used in the mental health professions. Is it or isn't it? When I first heard about it, I said, it doesn't matter what you call it. Where a child is not seeing one of the parents, there's something wrong. Now, it may be something wrong with the parent who's been so vicious or is so mad or is so addicted that there is, it is not in the interest of the child to see that parent. But you have to identify what's happening before you attach a label to it. And unfortunately, parental alienation has become an industry in the same way that the family law has become an industry. And there are people who profess to be experts who make a lot of money out of alleging parental alienation or defending against what's alleged to be parental alienation. And therefore, that's my legal training, is to identify what's happening and then to try to attach the appropriate label to it. And I think that until 10 years ago, dealing with cases of parental alienation was in fact sabotaged by the naming and by the objections, some of which are quite justified, to Gardner. He had a very small sample. He was dealing with a very small number of cases. Of course, Freud also had very few number of cases, and he invented this multi-trillion-dollar industry of psychiatry or psychoanalysis. Yeah. So that's not in and of itself a problem. But also, his papers were largely not peer-reviewed. They were self-published in many cases. So there are all kinds of technical reasons why it is convenient for people who are alleged to have done parental alienation to attack Gardner. And as I say, I think a well-experienced, a well-trained judge will look at the situation and will, rather like a doctor, right? He will do a differential diagnosis. And he will try to understand what's going on. Yeah. If, after he's done that, at least developed a hypothesis that one of the parents is, for no good reason, connected with the welfare of the child, preventing contact, right, or is influencing the child, then he will know what questions to ask the expert to how to untangle that. There's another issue here, together with all the things we've mentioned, and that is knowing what questions to ask, knowing how to frame the question, as well as knowing how to frame the order and the decision of the judge. Because if it's not framed properly, you're not going to get the right answer. Right. You're asking for apples, but in fact the problem is oranges. And so again, the judge needs to be able to develop a working hypothesis with the help of the lawyers, of course, and then try and explore that with the help of qualified experts. And there is a shortage of qualified experts. And as I say, there are many people who claim to be experts but don't know enough about interference with child-parent contact in order to be able to give the right information and the right recommendations to the court. That's a problem here. There are very few experts here in this country who know enough about it. And in other countries also, there are very few. Right. That's why, again, I'm talking about a generation. It'll take a generation. 20 years, 25 years, okay, until, that's one of the things I'm trying to get involved in. Yeah. Going to places where there are students of social work, students of psychology, students, medical students, yeah, law students, and expose them, yeah, to the things that can go wrong in families. What happens to a child when the parents are separating or getting divorced? And the whole spectrum of effects, of which what is called parental alienation is probably the extreme end. Right. If these people as students are exposed to it, and in their professional training they're exposed to it, right, and then their in-service certification training they're exposed to it,
Right.
Then, in the course of a generation, and it applies to lawyers and judges and so on.
Right.
I'm hoping in my lifetime, more people will understand what's going on and how to handle it.
I absolutely agree with you here, and all I'm thinking right now, as you and me and probably people who watching our interview right now have no doubt that parental alienation is a real thing. It's not a pseudo science as it's marked in Wikipedia, but unfortunately the World Health Organization didn't make the mind yet. It was already included in the next issue, but then, as I heard, it's been removed. And all the conflict that you and me watching there on the website has happened because there is a massive movement against parental alienation that probably also tried to discredit Richard Gardner in order to just put the whole thing into pseudoscience box, which is a really not helping us to promote it in that larger way that we would like to. And how you look at that World Health Organization decision?
I followed the debate in the World Health Organization. There's also, they wanted to put it in DSM, the American Psychiatric Association. The words parental alienation have become a problem.
Highly
the words
speculated.
themselves are a problem. And that's why I reached the conclusion quite early in my research and writing that we have to talk about the phenomenon and not the name. There are some countries where parental alienation is working well. In Ireland, for example, they have a very strong movement about parental alienation. In Northern Ireland as well. But there are many other countries where you say the word parental alienation and they throw you out simply because you pronounce those words. They're words which are not allowed. I'm talking about Germany and Switzerland. This I hear from colleagues there. So the terminology is getting in the way of understanding what's going on. That's why, as I say, I talk about contact failure, I talk about contact problems, I talk about contact interference. And that's one focus. The other focus has to be on what's happening to the child. Because those who say, my wife is alienating the children against me, that's at the level of the parents, the husband and wife, or two men or two women. It's known in all kinds of family structures. But if you look at it for what's happening with the child, then you put the focus where it really ought to be. Now, as we said before, this is a fairly new idea that cases which get to the family court are about someone who's not a party, a child. So my advice is, don't get too excited about the World Health Organization, playing around with this. Don't get too excited about the opposition to the term parental alienation. If there are in the DSM, if they are in the International Classification of Diseases, enough indicators that interference with the contact between the child and the parent is something which has health and public health effects, then that should be enough to persuade policymakers to do the change. And most sensible people assume that a child, for its development, needs both parents, and that breaking contact between a child and one of the parents is bad for the child, except, as I say, in those extreme situations where no contact at all is better than any kind of contact, which are very rare. But if we understand that a child does in fact need both parents, then interfering with that contact is maltreatment, abuse, whatever you want to call it. And that's why in my writing, I'm talking in those terms about child psychological maltreatment. There's another aspect to this as well, and that I'm trying to find funding for research. It's a public health issue.
Absolutely.
Because we know that these children in their adolescence will be using public health services in order to help them through the terrible psychological challenges they're going through. And as adults, they are damaged. They're damaged in the sense of their ability to make relationships. They're damaged in their ability to keep relationships, which means that if they have children, their children are going to be not able to function properly. But even as children, these children are going to have problems with concentrating at school. Their health needs are going to be an issue to be fought about in court rather than something the parents are committed to dealing with. Adolescents will find substitutes or ways of overcoming their distress. And it could be alcohol and drugs and indiscriminate sex and meeting up with the wrong people. And so if they're involved in drugs, then they're getting involved in crime, and they're going to put an onus on the police and prosecutions and that kind of stuff. And if girls are going to have children out when they're too young, then they're going to need help, and the children are going to need help. There's a whole scad of things, a whole battery of issues. And if these problems are dealt with properly at the earliest stage, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, then we're going to be saving money for governments down the line.
To fix that children later.
Exactly, it's better, and that's why, I don't know if you've seen my articles where I use a medical analogy. I sometimes start my lectures talking about Jeff Hall. Who was Jeff Hall? Jeff Hall played soccer for Birmingham City. That's my hometown. He played for England. Very talented guy. When I was 9 years old, he got polio and died. They just introduced vaccination against polio. A guy called Jonas Salk, a doctor in America, discovered that there was a germ that called polio. Before that, it was described as infantile paralysis, the symptom. When they identified the need, they were able to identify the problem and a vaccine. Now, who's heard of polio? There are, I think, 3 countries in the world where there's still polio. Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria, where there are religious objections among some people to vaccination. So you have to identify it, and then you have to increase public awareness. And when Jeff Hall died, everybody wanted to get their kids vaccinated against polio. Before that, some yes, some no. So you have to raise consciousness, and then you have to put in place a way of diagnosing these things. That's why I'm speaking, as I said, to school teachers and to doctors and to nurses and to social workers to identify the first signs of the problem. Because if you can then divert it, you don't let it reach the stage where parties are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to lawyers, and courts are spending days and days and days. And in some jurisdictions in the United States, each party had his own expert. Then they appoint another expert to criticize the experts on the other side. And the people who don't have money, who can't afford the lawyers and the experts, get a 3rd or 4th rate kind of justice. And the problems simply go on. You don't solve parental alienation as a phenomenon or child-parent contact problems as a phenomenon in the courtroom. You do it in the schoolroom. You teach adolescents about relationships, about responsibilities, about what to look for in a partner that they're going to make babies with.
Right.
Communication skills, problem-solving skills.
Right.
So we're trying to advance programs at that level so as to achieve this prevention. the PASG conference in Brussels in 3 weeks' time. In 2 weeks' time. I'm not coming. Today I recorded my lecture, but I'll be lecturing from here. They wanted me to record the lecture in order that if there's a technical breakdown, they'll have something to show the people. Right. But I'll certainly be attending the whole conference from here. Because of COVID and because of all kinds of other reasons, it just didn't work out for me to attend. The focus of that conference is prevention. Yeah. And that's for a very good reason. Nick Child, David Curl and I were at the conference in Philadelphia. Were you there? The PASG conference in 2018 or 2019 was in Philadelphia. And I'd already started talking about prevention, and Nick Child had started talking about prevention. A group of people got together at that conference and said, what are we going to do about prevention? That led to Nick Child and I being asked to send a questionnaire out. We sent a questionnaire out. We got some very interesting answers. Now in PASG, we've just formed a subcommittee on early identification and prevention. So this idea of prevention is very much a new thing, even in the field of what's called parental alienation.
It's very good. Do you planning to make a book?
We'll see what comes out of the conference. Okay. But certainly we want to encourage education. Yeah. We want to encourage training for all professions.
Some kind of manual.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. A manual.
Once I was in a Karen Woodall seminar in London a year and a half, and I just want to add a few things when you was describing the symptoms of the child and the consequences in the future. That child sometimes is also suicidal and they not come to the future. I like the way that it was described by Karen. She said that the trauma that the parent had, the parent who alienated the child and who child stay with, that trauma basically come to the child. So it's infected his identity and take him to all that stages which you described as a symptoms and behavior problem and attachment problem, because the child cannot find himself.
Right. And I know about Karen's work, and I've spoken on the same panel as Nick and Karen at conferences. Yeah. Their approach is a particular approach. They do excellent work. I again, because my training is as a lawyer, I don't get too deep into the science. But what I do know is that every child instinctively loves both parents.
And need them.
And needs both parents. And when the child finds him or herself in a position where they're rejecting a parent, that leads to a terrible loyalty conflict that is often resolved by psychological split. I've seen these kids in my chambers. That daddy is all bad and mommy is all good. There's no such thing. I was speaking last evening to a formerly alienated father here in Israel, and he said the therapist who dealt with the case asked his 15-year-old daughter, "Tell me now, immediately, do you remember anything good about Dad?" She thought, and she thought, and she thought. She said no. And the analyst said, Isn't that rather peculiar? Don't you think there's anything wrong with that?" And she said, "Well, I remember a birthday when Daddy was there. And that cracked the case. She was then able to see that either she'd been brainwashed by the mum, or she'd been using this technique of the psychological split to overcome her problem of loyalties. And what she'd done was an inadequate way of doing it, and it needed help. So I mean, that's just one example of how what Karen's talking about, how far the parent's experience as a child affect their parenting skills? Of course it does. It may affect it for the good, it may affect it for the bad.
What, in your opinion, and why there is such a polarization in a society when it's come to parental alienation?
But first of all, those who shout and scream about having been alienated, there are those guys who hung themselves on Buckingham Palace, or there were guys who were all men who were so infuriated that they came across as being angry and mad. Now, anybody who's been alienated from a child is entitled to be angry and mad. But it's very easy to stick the label on and say, well, he must be crazy, and therefore he must have done something to justify the alienation. The feminist discourse has affected this. The feminists have many, many achievements. They've achieved many of their objectives, but they're now going to, even in Israel, they're going in all kinds of directions which do not in fact help women. But there is of course, those who object to the terminology of parental alienation, and they have their own thing. And there are those who see it as a threat. And there are those who genuinely don't believe that it exists. As I said, it's counterintuitive. The strongest advocates about parental alienation are not the psychologists, and not the psychiatrists, and not the lawyers. They're the adults who, as children, were alienated. The strongest lectures and presentations I've heard are from these people in their 20s and 30s who realized that they were alienated, and realized that they were manipulated, and realized that they had part of their childhood and part of their identity stolen. These are the people who are the counter to the deniers. And now, in the last 2 or 3 years, we're seeing more and more lectures by these people. Obviously, it's a terrible thing to be an alienated child, and to open it up in public is a terrible, terrible thing to do. And you said some of them are suicidal. Many of them have turned to drugs and all kinds of stuff. So to actually open up about it in public, but there are people who are prepared to do that. And they do much better job at convincing people than I can do or than you can do, because they've actually been there. They've actually been they're the true victims.